Colorado Department of Corrections with no possibility of parole. With regard to counts 4 and 5 relating to Bella and Celeste as a different theory of first-degree murder, the court is going to sentence you to life in the Colorado Department of Corrections, and legally those sentences must run concurrently as a different theory of first-degree murder. Recognizing the unlawful termination of pregnancy for the unborn child that has been named Nico, the court absolutely believes that the maximum sentence of 48 years would be appropriate to run consecutive to the other charges, with an additional mandatory parole period of 3 years as set forth by statute.
There is a correctional officer in Wisconsin who has worked the overnight shift at the same facility for nearly 4 years. Every night, sometime between 3 and 4 in the morning, he walks the same corridor, passes the same reinforced doors, checks the same observation windows, and every night, without fail, when he reaches one particular cell, he sees the same thing. A man, sitting on the edge of a metal bunk, perfectly still, eyes fixed on the concrete wall directly ahead, not reading, not writing, not pacing, not sleeping, just sitting there, motionless, as though something behind that wall is visible only to him. The first time this officer saw it, he made a note. The second time, he mentioned it to a colleague. By the third week, he stopped mentioning it because there was nothing new to report. It was the same image every single night, same position, same wall, same absolute stillness. The only thing that changed was the officer's own reaction to it, because at a certain point, watching a human being do the exact same thing at the exact same hour, in the exact same position, night after night after night, stops feeling like observation and starts feeling like watching something slowly come apart from the inside. That man's name is Chris Watts, and that officer is not the only one who has noticed. Multiple corrections staff at Dodge Correctional Institution in Waupun, Wisconsin, the facility where Watts has been held for over 7 years, have reportedly described the same observation independently of one another, not through press conferences or official statements, but through the quiet professional channels that exist inside every correctional facility. The shift reports, the informal conversations between people whose job requires them to watch someone 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, year after year, without cameras, without journalists, without anyone on the outside asking what they actually see. What they are describing is not what most people picture when they imagine a man serving 5 consecutive life sentences for murdering his pregnant wife and 2 young daughters. It is not rage. It is not violence. It is not the dramatic breakdown that makes for compelling television. It is something that the people who study this professionally, forensic psychologists, behavioral scientists, researchers, who have spent entire careers documenting what prolonged isolation does to the human brain, say is actually far more disturbing than any of those things. They say he is not the same person anymore. And the way in which he is not the same is precisely the thing that almost nobody covering this case has properly examined. This video is not going to walk you through August 13th, 2018. You already know that date. You already know what happened inside that house in Frederick, Colorado. You have seen that timeline reconstructed in dozens of videos, read it in hundreds of articles, sat through it more times than you can count. You do not need it again. What you have not been told is what has been happening since the guilty plea was entered, since the courtroom doors closed, since the sentence was handed down, and the world moved on to the next headline. What has been unfolding inside that facility, documented in disciplinary records, observed by corrections staff, revealed in letters that have been reviewed by forensic behavioral specialists, and confirmed by decades of peer-reviewed research on what extended isolation does to the human mind, has never been assembled into a single coherent picture anywhere in the coverage of this case. Until now. If this is the kind of carefully researched content you have been searching for, the kind that goes beyond the surface and treats you like the intelligent viewer you are, then you are exactly where you need to be. This is Beyond the Verdict. Subscribe right now and turn on notifications so you do not miss what comes next, because by the end of this video, you are going to understand something deeply unsettling about what is unfolding inside that cell, and it raises a question grounded entirely in documented science that nobody in mainstream coverage has been willing to ask out loud. Let us begin with the transfer, because that is where the documented record starts, and it is where the first critical question was raised and never answered. December 2018, barely 6 weeks after Chris Watts entered his guilty plea and received 5 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole, the Colorado Department of Corrections made a decision that was treated at the time as a minor procedural detail and should have been treated as something far more significant. They moved him out of the state entirely. Not to another facility within the Colorado system, not somewhere nearby where family members, attorneys, or journalists could easily reach him, but over 1,000 miles away, to Dodge Correctional Institution in Waupun, Wisconsin. The official reason given by a spokesperson for the Colorado Department of Corrections was straightforward: safety concerns related to his status as a high-profile offender. The Wisconsin Department of Corrections declined to confirm the transfer at the time, citing the Interstate Corrections Compact. But former corrections professionals who have spoken publicly about cases of this nature have been consistent in their assessment of what safety concerns actually means in this context. Individuals convicted of crimes against children occupy the lowest position in the social hierarchy of any correctional facility without exception. The hostility directed at them from other inmates is documented, persistent, and severe. In Watts's specific case, the nature of what he had done, killing his pregnant wife and 2 young daughters in the home they shared, made that dynamic more intense than most. And it was not only inmates. Reports indicated that even some corrections officers within the Colorado system, professionals whose sworn legal obligation it was to ensure his safety, were struggling to maintain professional neutrality around him. Think about what that means. The people whose job, whose legal duty, is to keep you alive, find your presence so intolerable that relocating you across state lines becomes the only workable solution. That tells you something about where you now stand in the world you permanently occupy. But the urgency of that transfer quietly raised a question that no official source has ever answered clearly. What exactly was happening inside the Colorado system in those first 6 weeks, barely a month and a half after sentencing, that made the authorities determine they genuinely could not keep him there? They cited safety. They said nothing further. That question has never been resolved. What has been resolved, carefully and over time, is what happened after he arrived at Dodge. Dodge Correctional Institution is not a standard maximum security prison. Before it housed inmates, it functioned as a state psychiatric hospital, originally known as the Central State Hospital for the Criminally Insane. Ed Gein, the killer whose crimes became the foundation for some of the most disturbing fictional characters in American cultural history, the inspiration behind Psycho, The Silence of the Lambs, and the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, was held within those walls. Stephen Avery, whose case generated a global conversation through a widely viewed documentary series, passed through those same corridors. This is a facility built specifically to contain the individuals that society has classified as its most irredeemable. Chris Watts, former oil field operator from Frederick, Colorado, former husband, former father of 2 little girls and an unborn son, has been one of them for over 7 years. To understand what the documented behavioral record from inside that facility actually means, you need to understand the physical environment producing it. Picture a space approximately 8 feet by 10 feet, a concrete floor, a metal bunk bolted to the wall, a steel toilet with no privacy screen, one small window reinforced with layered glass and wire mesh that looks out onto more concrete, overhead lighting that does not differentiate between 7 in the morning and 10 at night, the same artificial brightness, the same flat, unchanging light around the clock. That is where Chris Watts spends 23 hours of every single day. The remaining hour, if his conduct on that specific day has earned it, is spent outside the cell in a controlled, limited environment. Then the door closes again. Meals arrive through a slot in the door. He does not go to a cafeteria. He does not sit across a table from another human being and share a meal. The slot opens. The tray appears. The slot closes. That is the transaction. That is the entirety of it. every single day, is structurally identical to the one before it and the one that will follow. There is no weekend, there is nothing on any calendar that changes what any given Tuesday looks like, sounds like, or feels like. There is no variation, there is no novelty, there is nothing new. Here is where this stops being about punishment and starts being about documented science. What was just described has a peer-reviewed, clinically established effect on the human brain, and it does not care who you are, what you did, or whether you deserve to be there. The brain does not make moral distinctions when it comes to the damage isolation inflicts. It responds to the conditions, not to the person inside them. Decades of research on prolonged solitary confinement, conducted on inmate populations, on participants in long-duration isolation simulations, and on former prisoners of war, have mapped precisely what happens to human cognition when social contact and environmental variation are removed for extended periods. The first thing to deteriorate is time perception. The brain requires novelty to mark the passage of time accurately. New experiences create distinct memories, and those distinct memories are how the brain measures duration. Without novelty, hours and days become genuinely difficult to distinguish from one another. Weeks blur, months collapse. The internal clock stops working correctly because there is nothing for it to measure against. Then come perceptual disturbances. Individuals in extended isolation begin hearing sounds that are not there, voices, movements in the periphery. They see shifts in their visual field that do not correspond to anything real. Researchers call this stimulus hunger. The brain, starved of external input, begins generating its own sensory data because the environment is providing none. And critically, the mind can no longer reliably distinguish between what it has manufactured and what is actually happening around it. Then, mood disruption, not ordinary sadness. A specific variety of depression characterized in the clinical literature by emotional flattening, the inability to feel anticipation or pleasure, and the gradual erosion of what psychologists call future orientation, the capacity to imagine that tomorrow might be different from today, that anything ahead might be worth holding on to. Under sustained isolation, that capacity begins to die. Then cognitive decline, memory problems, difficulty concentrating, the slow deterioration of the neural networks responsible for social processing, the systems that allow a human being to read tone in someone's voice, to follow a conversational thread, to understand what another person is actually communicating beneath the surface of their words. These systems require practice. They require social contact. Without it, they break down in ways that are measurable, documented, and at a certain threshold, irreversible. And then, at the far end of extended isolation, paranoia, full breaks from reality, documented psychotic episodes in individuals with no prior history of psychosis. Not people who were already unstable, ordinary people whose minds, under the sustained pressure of total isolation, simply fractured. The United Nations does not classify prolonged solitary confinement as severe punishment. They classify it as torture. Chris Watts has been living inside those conditions for over 7 years, and the corrections officers who observe him daily have begun documenting what that looks like in practice. During his time at Dodge Correctional, Watts received multiple formal disciplinary citations, unauthorized communication, unauthorized transfer of personal property, possession of contraband, refusal to follow direct orders from corrections staff. On their own, those violations might seem unremarkable in a maximum security setting. People break rules in prison. That is not a story. The story is what those violations actually involved. He was cited for transferring a collection of personal belongings to another inmate. Not weapons, not drugs, not anything that posed a security risk. His books, his hygiene products, his soap, his shampoo, his toothbrush, his underwear. In the stripped-down world of a prison cell, where personal possessions are reduced to the absolute minimum, these are the last remaining markers of individual identity, the things that belong to nobody else. Surrendering them is not a strategic exchange. It is not someone maneuvering within a prison hierarchy. It is someone purchasing proximity, paying for the sensation of genuine human connection with the only currency he had left. His most personal possessions exchanged for the feeling, however manufactured, however distorted, that he mattered to someone. It did not stop there. Watts had reportedly been placing phone calls to that inmate's family members on the outside. He reportedly enlisted his own parents, who were still occasionally in contact with him, to reach out on his behalf. He was constructing an elaborate social network through another person's family, across state lines, simply to maintain the feeling of being connected to something beyond those walls, building a proxy life through another person's relationships because his own had been permanently severed by his own hand. This is not the behavior of someone operating with intact cognitive and emotional function. This is the behavior of someone whose understanding of appropriate social boundaries has significantly deteriorated, someone whose brain, deprived of genuine human contact over years, has begun accepting substitutes that a psychologically intact mind would immediately recognize as disproportionate and desperate. But the disciplinary record is only part of what observers inside Dodge have noted. He has been reported talking to himself, not quietly, not occasionally, sustained one-sided conversations with no other participant, noted independently by multiple individuals in proximity to him inside the facility. During conversations with actual people present, he loses the thread. His gaze fixes somewhere in the middle distance, and he goes somewhere else entirely. Then he attempts to re-enter the exchange, as though the gap did not happen, sometimes resuming the exact sentence he had been building, sometimes beginning somewhere entirely unrelated, as though the conversation he left and the one he returned to are in his mind the same. His personal hygiene has declined in ways that people familiar with who he was before incarceration find difficult to reconcile. In 2018, Chris Watts was described by those who knew him as meticulous about his appearance. Reports from inside Dodge over recent years describe someone who now sometimes goes multiple days without showering, even when access is available. That specific symptom, degraded self-care in someone previously fastidious about their appearance, is a documented clinical marker of severe depression, compounded by cognitive decline. And then, the detail that pulls everything together, the corrections officers on overnight rounds, seeing him awake at 3 in the morning, 4, sometimes 5, sitting on the edge of the bunk, staring at the wall, completely still, for hours. When the brain receives no meaningful differentiation between daylight and darkness, no temperature variation, no social cues anchoring the circadian rhythm, it loses the ability to regulate sleep architecture correctly. The biological systems that govern rest become completely unmoored. We are not at the beginning of this process. We are 7 years in. Now the letters, because this is where something genuinely revealing enters the picture. Since renewed documentary attention brought this case back into broader conversation through 2024 and into 2025, the volume of mail reaching Watts at Dodge has increased significantly. He responds to a substantial portion of it. His letters have been reviewed by journalists, discussed by people who have corresponded with him directly, and examined by forensic behavioral specialists. What they reveal is a consistent, clinically recognizable pattern. On the surface, the letters contain what accountability sounds like. He acknowledges responsibility. He references carrying the weight of what happened. He writes about Shanann, about Bella, about Celeste, about Nico. He uses the language of remorse. And then, within the same letter, sometimes within the same paragraph, the framing quietly shifts. The marriage had complications outsiders could not fully see. There were pressures that shaped him in ways people did not understand. The full picture, he insists, is more complex than what the public record reflects. That phrase, the full picture, threads through his correspondence repeatedly. Forensic psychologists have documented this pattern extensively across individuals serving permanent sentences. It is called mitigation narrative construction. It is not unique to Watts. It is not necessarily conscious deception. It is what the brain does when holding unfiltered reality in a closed environment over years without relief becomes psychologically unsustainable. The mind builds scaffolding around the truth to make continued existence alongside it possible. Genuine accountability, the kind forensic psychologists describe as real rather than performed, does not require a surrounding framework. It does not return to external pressures or attach conditions to the acknowledgement of what was done. it simply holds the weight. A prison source cited by a major national publication reported that Watts spends the majority of his commissary budget not on food, not on books, but on stamps and paper. Every week, year after year, writing to women he has never met, in places he will never go, building relationships that exist entirely on paper. That single verified detail communicates more about the current psychological state inside that cell than most coverage of this case has managed in years. The obsessive attachment pattern that behavioral analysts identified as central to what led to August 13, 2018, the consuming need for emotional connection, did not end with the crime. It was not contained by the sentence. It is active right now, expressed through letters to women he has never been in the same room with. Multiple behavioral analysts identified this anxious enmeshed attachment dynamic as the governing psychological structure of Chris Watts in the period leading up to August 2018, his relationship with Shanann, his relationship with Nicole Kessinger, the way both connections operated not as parts of his life but as the scaffolding holding the entire structure upright, the inability to regulate emotionally without consuming reciprocated attachment, the way perceived instability in either relationship produced not measured response, but complete destabilization. That structure did not dissolve behind the walls of Dodge Correctional. The stamps and paper confirm it is still running, every week, against the only material available to it. That is not a changed man. That is the identical psychological architecture that produced the worst morning in the Watts family's history, now operating in the only environment it has access to. Most people assume that years of confinement, surrounded by nothing but time and consequences, eventually produce someone fundamentally different at their core. That the weight of what was done, carried long enough in a small enough space, reshapes the person carrying it. The evidence from Dodge points towards something considerably more disturbing. The core patterns are not dissolving under the pressure of incarceration. They are intensifying, running harder and more completely, because the ordinary complexity of daily life that once partially managed them has been stripped away entirely. There is nothing for those patterns to run against, except other people's letters. And so that is what they consume, completely, without the friction of a real world around them. Now we arrive at the statement itself. In correspondence described by those who reviewed it as increasingly desperate and emotionally unguarded, Watts reportedly reached a point where the psychological accumulation had become, in his own framing, unbearable. He wrote about sitting inside the cell with the silence pressing in from every direction, about memories returning in waves he could not control, family dinners, the sound of his daughters laughing, ordinary evenings that at the time would have seemed entirely unremarkable, forgettable moments that inside that cell, surrounded by nothing else, cannot be set aside, cannot be interrupted, cannot be escaped. He wrote about the feeling of being trapped not just physically, but in a way that was specifically mental. That prison had taken his freedom and handed him something he had not anticipated. Endless broken time that always circled back to the same place, without exception, without relief. And then the words that reportedly appeared in his writing, the words that stopped everyone who read them. I cannot live here anymore. The immediate reaction those words produce in most people deserves to be named honestly. For a significant portion of the people who have followed this case, the instinctive response is something close to satisfaction. He built that cell himself through deliberate choices that ended 4 lives. The suffering is not incidental to the sentence. It is the sentence. That response is not wrong. It is human. It is exactly what Frank Razuchek, Shanann's father, gave voice to when he stood at that sentencing and told Chris Watts directly that he wanted him to see what he had done every time he closed his eyes. But here is the question the clinical literature raises. Is what Watts is expressing the weight of genuine moral reckoning finally breaking through after 7 years? Or is it something the isolation research has a different, more disturbing name for? At a certain point in the progression of severe extended isolation, the human brain loses the capacity to hold 2 incompatible things simultaneously. It loses the ability to hold what it knows to be factually true alongside what it cannot psychologically survive accepting as fully, completely, and irreversibly true. What that produces is not dramatic collapse. It is something quieter, a slow divergence between the words a person uses and the complete moral weight those words are supposed to carry. The question is not whether he is suffering. He is. That is documented, observable, and entirely consistent with what his environment is designed to produce. The question is what he believes he cannot live with, whether the specific, intact moral weight of why he is there is still completely present inside that suffering, or whether the isolation has already begun separating the raw experience of punishment from the coherent understanding of what that punishment is actually for. Then came the late 2025 correspondence reported by a major national publication, drawn from letters dated across the final months of that year. Chris Watts wrote to a pen pal that God had placed him in prison deliberately, that his incarceration was not the consequence of choices he had made but divine will, part of a larger plan he was being prepared for. And then he drew a direct comparison between his own imprisonment and the crucifixion of Jesus Christ. The immediate response is outrage. The outrage is entirely understandable, but the more significant response is clinical rather than emotional. According to his own detailed confession given to investigators, Chris Watts planned and executed the murders of Shanann, Bella, Celeste, and their unborn son Nico. He strangled Shanann in their marital home. He drove Bella and Celeste to a remote oil field worksite. He submerged their bodies in crude oil storage tanks. He then returned home and the following morning stood in front of that same house on local television, pleading for his family's safe return. That man is the man sitting in a Wisconsin cell comparing his imprisonment to the crucifixion of Christ. This is precisely what the clinical literature predicts for someone at this stage of psychological deterioration under prolonged isolation. The self-protective reframing of one's own suffering as cosmically significant, as divinely ordained, because holding the unvarnished reality without that framework has become psychologically impossible to sustain. The man sentenced in November 2018 is not the man in that cell today, not because he has grown or arrived at anything resembling redemption, but because the environment designed to deliver his punishment has altered the architecture of his mind in ways the research describes as largely irreversible at this duration. There is a dimension of his daily existence at Dodge that has been almost entirely absent from coverage of this case. Prison operates on two simultaneous hierarchies: the official one, reflected in housing assignments and disciplinary standing, and the unofficial one, that every person who enters a correctional facility understands within days of arrival. At the absolute bottom, consistent across facility types, across states, across decades of documented research, are people who harm children. A significant proportion of men serving time in any maximum security facility are fathers. They have children on the outside. They carry photographs they look at when no one is watching. They are counting days toward, however remote, the possibility of seeing those children again. Those children are what makes the sentence survivable. When those men encounter someone who had exactly what they miss most intensely, a family that was intact, children who loved him, and destroyed all of it through calculated, premeditated action, the response is immediate and personal. Chris Watts has occupied the bottom of that hierarchy since the moment he arrived. Without corrections officers in direct physical proximity, he faces danger. Every movement through that facility, every moment outside that cell, he moves with the knowledge that his safety depends entirely on staff being exactly where they need to be, at exactly the right moment. He keeps his head down. He avoids any space that is not closely monitored. He chooses the cell over the common area whenever possible. That is not preference. That is survival calculation made dozens of times each day. Researchers describe this permanent anticipation of physical danger as one of the most psychologically corrosive dimensions of incarceration for high-profile inmates. Not the violence itself, but the chronic awareness of its proximity. The way sustained alertness compounds every other stressor simultaneously: the isolation, the sleep disruption, the cognitive erosion, each one feeding and accelerating the others without relief. Now the question this entire video has been building toward. Extended isolation does not have a stabilization point. The longer the exposure, the more severe and irreversible the damage becomes. There is a threshold in the research where the subject is no longer experiencing punishment in a fully coherent sense, Not because they no longer know they are in prison. Watts knows. He will always know. But because the cognitive capacity required to hold cause alongside consequence, to maintain the intact connection between choices made and what those choices permanently produced, begins to fragment. When that fragmentation reaches a certain depth, the person is experiencing the mechanical repetition of identical days, the slot, the wall, the light at 4 in the morning, but the specific moral weight that makes those conditions meaningful as punishment becomes increasingly impossible to sustain. Frank Razuchek stood at that sentencing and expressed the desire that Watts would see what he had done every time he closed his eyes. The clinical evidence suggests that the capacity to carry that vision coherently, with its full weight intact, may not survive 3 more decades of what Dodge Correctional is delivering. This is not an argument for altering his sentence. 5 consecutive life terms without parole is exactly where Chris Watts belongs, without qualification, without caveat. What is being examined here is the gap between what most people imagine long-term isolation does to a human mind and what the documented science shows it actually produces. He is 40 years old. If he lives to average male life expectancy, approximately 36 more years remain inside that facility. The behavioral trajectory does not point toward stabilization. The cognitive deterioration continues. The perceptual fragmentation continues. The erosion of coherent self-reflection continues. And when the man in that cell has deteriorated past coherent self-awareness, 5 life sentences will still be running. The door will remain closed. The slot will open and close again. But the interior experience that gives those sentences their meaning, the conscious understanding of why he is there and what he took from the world, will have been progressively dismantled by the same conditions designed to deliver it. That is what we are watching unfold. That is what the corrections officers at Dodge are describing when they say he is not the same anymore. Before this video closes, there is something it would be morally incomplete without. Everything examined here, the behavioral changes, the letters, the prison hierarchy, the isolation science, the question of what punishment means across decades, all of it only carries weight in reference to 4 people who had absolutely no say in what was done to them. Shannon Watts was 34 years old. She had built a life, documented it with generosity and genuine warmth, and loved it without apology. She had a business she believed in, a home she was proud of, 2 daughters she was fully present with, in a way that everything she left behind makes impossible to misread. She was 15 weeks pregnant on the morning of August 13, 2018. She had a prenatal appointment that very day to learn the gender of the son she had already named Nico. She never made it. Bella was 4 years old. The morning her father loaded her into the back of his truck was supposed to be her first day of school. She had a backpack. She had gone to sleep the night before carrying whatever a 4-year-old carries in her imagination about tomorrow, the particular anticipation of something that has never happened before, and that she had been promised was coming. Celeste was 3, old enough to have a personality entirely and recognizably her own, old enough that the people who loved her will spend the rest of their lives encountering her unexpectedly, in ordinary moments they were not prepared for. A particular sound, a phrase, a specific kind of laugh. Nico never had his name spoken to his face, never drew a breath outside his mother's body, never had a first day of anything, or a last day of anything, or any day at all. If this video gave you something you have not encountered in coverage of this case before, please like it now and share it with someone who cares about these stories being told responsibly. Every share places this content in front of people who believe true crime coverage should honor the people it is ultimately about. This is Beyond the Verdict. If you are not already subscribed, hit that button and turn on notifications right now, because this channel is not finished with this case. For Shannon, for Bella, for Celeste, and for Nico, who never had a single day. Justice is not a moment, it is a direction, and this channel is not done moving toward it.